Gracias. Ahora sí. Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Es un gusto saludarles en esta segunda jornada de nuestro seminario permanente de investigación de frontera en psicología social comunitaria. Hoy es un día muy especial, es muy importante porque estamos celebrando el Día de las y los psicólogos de nuestro hermano país de México, y desde toda, pues, desde ese seminario y desde toda Latinoamérica, pues nos unimos a esa celebración. Dentro de la segunda jornada, pues esta mañana tuvimos la posibilidad de compartir un diálogo, y ahora en la tarde, ya tarde-noche, nos va a acompañar el profesor Christopher. El profesor Christopher Sonn es profesor de la Universidad de Victoria en Melbourne, Australia. Allí él trabaja en la tierra de los Wurundjeri de la nación Kulin. Es becario del Instituto de Salud y Deporte y subdirector de investigación e información investigadora. Su investigación se ocupa de comprender y cambiar las dinámicas de la opresión, examinando la violencia estructural como el racismo y sus efectos en las identidades sociales, las interrelaciones intergrupales y las pertenencias. Él trabaja un enfoque central, que es la creación conjunta de entornos, y un enfoque dentro y fuera de la universidad que pueda apoyar acciones orientadas hacia la resistencia, la curación y la liberación. Tiene una cátedra de visitante en la Universidad de Witwatersrand en Sudáfrica. El profesor Christopher es coeditor de creación de conocimiento inclusivo y trabaja psicología de la liberación. Es coautor de Psicología Social y Vida Cotidiana y es editor asociado de la revista estadounidense de Psicología Comunitaria y Psicología Comunitaria en Perspectiva Global. Entonces, nos complace poder estar en compañía del profesor Christopher, a quien le agradecemos muchísimo que haya aceptado la invitación y compartir con todas nosotras y nosotros este espacio de diálogo que hemos venido desarrollando a lo largo del seminario de frontera. Entonces, quiero darle la bienvenida al profesor Christopher y pues adelante, tiene la palabra.
Profe John Gregory, antes de esto, para un saludo desde la Universidad Nacional Abierta a Distancia al profesor
Claro que
Christopher, a todos los colegas, compañeros de Latinoamérica que están conectados. De nuevo seguimos celebrando el Día del Psicólogo en México. Gracias por haber aceptado esta invitación. Para nosotros será muy interesante poderlo escuchar y poder compartir y seguir haciendo redes de trabajo con usted. Doctora Catherine, gracias por brindarnos también la posibilidad de estar con ustedes el día de hoy, de acompañarnos. Un abrazo desde Colombia, y doctora Catherine, tiene entonces usted la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias, maestra María del Pilar, doctor John Gregory, doctor Christopher, por estar aquí con nosotros, con nosotras. Gracias también a los participantes, a las participantes que están desde diferentes lugares de América Latina. Creo que hoy día es vigente replantearnos, repensar, o como decía esta mañana, y pensar en las palabras de Manuel Wallenstein, lo que es nuestro quehacer disciplinar. Específicamente, plantearnos con quién estamos trabajando en la psicología social comunitaria y desde dónde. En este sentido, me parece que, en efecto, lo que nos trae Christopher el día de hoy va a ser de suma importancia, porque él ha avanzado un trabajo bastante arduo a nivel académico, en lo que refiere a, obviamente, el accionar con los pueblos indígenas, con los pueblos afrodescendientes, en el caso australiano. Que, digamos, la situación que viven los pueblos originarios en Australia no está lejana también de la situación que viven nuestros pueblos en nuestra América. En ese sentido, compartimos historias muy particulares de opresión, históricamente de racismo, de discriminación. Que bueno, creo que desde nuestro quehacer podríamos abonar, a subvertir estas formas, a generar procesos libertarios, acompañando a los pueblos indígenas, originarios y también afrodescendientes. Entonces, para nosotros va a ser esto que nos trae y por supuesto con toda la audiencia que siempre a partir de sus preguntas tan pertinentes nos ayuda a repensar estos ejercicios de la construcción de conocimiento colectivo. Gracias entonces a todos y a todas.
Okay, so Professor Sonn, we are very glad and you deserve a very warm welcome to this academic event. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us today as a presenter. You can go ahead.
I can go ahead. Well, thank you very much, Catherine and John Gregory and Maria and the organizing committee for inviting me to present at this event. I'm really honored. The only thing that I'm disappointed about is that I can't speak in Spanish to communicate with you, but I'm really grateful for Yvette for interpreting to convey some of the messages of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues in Australia. So the first slide, do you want me to keep going, Yvette, or you'll just have to give me a nod, yeah, when you want me to stop? Maybe stop there first and then.
Okay, Professor, thank you. Just a little time for me to let the audience know about your ideas, right? Okay, el profesor nos acaba de agradecer este espacio a los presentes, también por escucharlo, por invitarle a esta participación importante, un poco desilusionado por no interactuar con nosotros, pueblos de Latinoamérica y los presentes en el evento en español.
Okay, so I have the title here, and I've put my colleague, Paola Balla, who is a Wemba Indigenous woman, on as a co-presenter because she is the person who speaks on the video in slide 18. So that's why I have that presented in that way. So we can go to the next slide. So I would first like to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I acknowledge Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander colleagues, their struggles, resilience, and survivance. I'm thankful they have welcomed and included me in the spaces that they continue to create to heal, recover, and decolonize. I work at Victoria University on the land of the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. It is on this land, with many groups, that I, a member of the African diaspora, a Black settler, is learning, deconstructing, and co-constructing decolonial praxis in the context of liberation and community psychology. Next
Okay,
slide.
Professor,
Yes.
just give me a second, please. Thank you. El profesor Sonn agradece a sus colegas aborígenes e isleños del Estrecho de Torres, sus luchas, su resistencia y su supervivencia. También les agradece que lo hayan acogido e incluido en esos espacios que siguen creando para sanar, recuperar y decolonizar. Trabaja en la Universidad de Victoria, en la tierra de los Boonwurrung y los Wurundjeri de la nación de Kulin. Es una tierra con muchos grupos donde él, como miembro de diáspora africana, colono negro, está aprendiendo y deconstruyendo y co-construyendo la praxis decolonial en el contexto de la liberación y las psicologías comunitarias. Go ahead, Professor.
Okay. Okay, so this is only to signify to people that there's a link here, and this is a group that we have created at Victoria University that brings together academics, researchers, students, community members who are interested in research around the themes of identity, displacement, and community. There's a link there, and it captures some of the videos and seminars and some of the work that we've been doing over the years, if people are interested in that.
Ok, profesor. So, la red de investigación sobre comunidad, identidad y desplazamiento, el cual tiene el link dispuesto en esta presentación, es un espacio intelectual público donde se fomentan y promueven las actividades de investigación. Esta amplia red pretende reunir y fomentar la investigación académica sobre las nuevas diásporas y los significados cambiantes del desplazamiento y la identidad.
I think we can go to the next one. Yeah. Okay. So today I will speak briefly about the context. I will speak specifically about some of the language, the concepts from decolonial writing and developments that we've been engaging with. I will place in the context of a process, a methodology that we've been developing around community engaged research. And then I will give three examples, two from the African diaspora and the one video, and highlight some of the key coordinates of the work that we've been producing that seeks to produce a psychology from below.
Ok, en versión general, el profesor nos va a demostrar acerca del contexto de estas coordenadas teóricas y conceptuales, aparte de una investigación comprometida con la comunidad para la opción decolonial. Nos va también a mostrar acerca de dos ejemplos de proyectos en los cuales él ha estado involucrado y nos va a contextualizar ciertos puntos clave acerca de ese tipo de proyectos.
Okay, so this is basically, and probably shouldn't have put this one in, but so some key questions that have been driving our research is how community arts or arts for justice can be mobilized towards liberation and resistance, to make visible various forms of violence, structural violence, cultural violence, symbolic violence, and for us in particular around racialization, which is a product of a much longer history of colonialism and coloniality as it shapes relationships in the Australian context.
Okay. El área de enfoque, cómo se movilizan las artes comunitarias hacia la liberación y la resistencia a la violencia estructural, cultural y simbólica, en particular el racismo y la racionalización, que es un producto de la historia del colonialismo y la continuidad de las relaciones de poder realizadas y racializadas en Australia.
Okay, so I think so people will know Australia is on the other side of the world for you, but one of the key aspects for us to understand about Australia is that it is a settler colonial society, and one of the authors, Aileen Morton Robinson, is a distinguished Indigenous professor, and she has written about race and whiteness and speaks of the possessiveness of whiteness in the Australian context, in particular, how belonging is shaped through understandings of whiteness and colonial mentality. So she writes that belonging to Australia was racialized and inextricably tied to the accumulation of capital and the social worth, authority, and ownership that this conferred. For Indigenous people were excluded from this condition of belonging. The white body was the norm and measure for identifying who could belong. And I guess in many ways, Eurocentrism is embedded in this particular understanding of how the world works and how the world operates. And we can see some some of these sets of assumptions, not only in the Australian settler colonialism, but also in forms of settler colonialism and colonialism that characterizes many of the societies and countries in the global south.
Ok. Australia, una sociedad colonial de colonos. Nos significa el profesor Sonn que una autora indígena de Australia él no percibe como desde el otro lado del mundo nosotros percibimos esta parte, pero está racializada esa otra parte donde él nos está compartiendo esta experiencia, está ligada a la acumulación de capital y al valor social, la autoridad y la propiedad que todos los contextos puedan obtener o nos puedan mostrar. Los indígenas en esas tierras fueron excluidos de una condición de pertenencia. El cuerpo blanco era la norma y la medida para identificar quién podía pertenecer a esos contextos. Go ahead, Professor.
Next slide. So these are just some basic examples of what this means to live in a settler colonial society where particular ways of being are central to our institutions. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in various surveys and people who speak languages other than English, 50% of people say that they've experienced racism in everyday life. African migrants also report in fairly high numbers that they experience discrimination in everyday life. For Aboriginal people, they report in all indicators of health, well-being, and participation, they are much lower than many communities. So these particular statistics or surveys provides a background or sort of an evidence for the sorts of ways in which race continues to shape the everyday lives of people who are either racialized or made other. And so these categories include not only the African descendants, but migrants of color from various other countries. Knowing and understanding that Australia is often described as a country made up of migrants on the basis of the dispossession of Aboriginal people. Yeah.
Okay, Professor.
Okay,
nos está mostrando el profesor en esta presentación unas cifras bastante altas reportadas por indígenas aborígenes, pero también personas que hablan otros idiomas como fuera del inglés, personas que han sido migrantes en Australia y han sufrido de alguna manera o han experimentado de alguna manera unos reportes de discriminación en sus contextos. Estas cifras han sido obtenidas a través de unas encuestas y de reportes de estas personas. Go ahead, Professor.
Okay, next one. Okay, so I mean, there's obviously lots of different ways of thinking about race and racism, but some of the work that have been very helpful for us has come from the Latin American diaspora. So Ramon Grosfoguel, I think, who is from Puerto Rico originally, who's been writing and providing a much longer lens for understanding race and racism as structural, as historical, and with roots in colonialism. So it's not so much about prejudice and individual discrimination, but to understand that there's a much longer history that continues to reproduce itself. So their version and their definition of racism is part of a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority that have been politically, culturally, economically produced and reproduced for centuries by institutions of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric modern colonial world system. And so this is very important for us because we can see the continuities and expressions of capitalism as broad structures. But for psychologists, so community psychologists, liberation psychologists, we are interested in how those expressions or how these particular structures find expressions in everyday lives and power relationships. So part of this definition and part of this thinking is that drawing on Frantz Fanon's understanding of those who are above and below the line of the human, is that those who are above the line are recognized socially in their humanity as human beings, and thus enjoying access to rights, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, and labor rights, material resources, and social recognition through their subjectivities, identities, epistemologies, and spiritualities. Those below the line aren't afforded such privileges, access, and resources and recognition. Next one.
Give me just a second, Professor, please. May I?
Sorry there?
May I? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, I can hear you.
All right, okay, so yes, that one. Okay. El racismo es una jerarquía global de superioridad e inferioridad, nos acaba de comentar el profesor Sonn, que ha sido producida y reproducida política, cultural y económicamente durante siglos por las instituciones del sistema mundial moderno, colonial, capitalista, patriarcal, creado en Occidente y cristiano. Aquellas personas que están por encima de la línea como reconocidas socialmente en su humanidad como seres humanos y por tanto gozan de acceso a esos privilegios llamados derechos, como los derechos humanos, como derechos civiles, como los derechos de las mujeres y los laborales, y además a los recursos materiales, y reconocimiento social a sus subjetividades, identidades, epistemologías y espiritualidades.
So we've been thinking and engaging with the more recent resurgent decolonial turn, and so some of the sorts of, I've just placed some definitions here that basically makes the point that even though colonialism as a structure, as a way of organizing, has been removed from lots of countries, coloniality, and I think coloniality as ways of being, knowing and doing persists in many societies. It's kept alive in the cultural resources. It's kept alive in books, in criteria of academic performance, cultural patterns, in common sense, the self-image, the habits and ways of being, ways of living, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our experiences. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. I think this is a very useful and very powerful concept that opens up the different sorts of ways in which power or ideologies, and ideologies of race, ideologies of gender, ideologies of ableism, heteronormativity, and so forth, continues to be reproduced in everyday sorts of ways and in everyday sorts of systems. The opposite, the concept of decoloniality, as people have written, is useful because it shows and it allows us to investigate and understand these more insidious forms of colonial violence, whether symbolic violence, cultural violence, that persist via occupation of mind and being, even when occupation of land has ended. So for some colleagues, the emphasis on decoloniality is not a move to dilute struggles of decolonization or to recognize white futurity, but it's about mobilizing stronger responses to colonialism. So it is about organizing, it is about coming together, and it is about understanding and unpacking white supremacy, not to make that visible as part of our deconstruction and retrieving, I think in Martin Borot's terms, it would be recovery of historical memory as part of this process of reimagining futures. Okay, Yvette?
Thank you, Professor.
Maria's laughing now.
Bueno, el profesor Sonn nos acaba de explicar, compartiéndonos acerca de colonialidad y decolonialidad. Nos comenta que la colonialidad es una estructura que ha sido impuesta a través de estructuras políticas, sociales, económicas, y sobrevive al colonialismo. Se mantiene viva esa colonialidad no solamente en los libros, sino también en los criterios de rendimiento académico, en los patrones culturales, igualmente en el sentido común, en la autoimagen de los pueblos y en las aspiraciones del yo, y de tantos otros aspectos de nuestra experiencia moderna, que en cierto modo, como sujetos modernos, respiramos colonialidad todo el tiempo y todos los días. El concepto de decolonialidad entonces nos podría significar unas manifestaciones un poco más lentas, menos espectaculares y un poco más insidiosas de la violencia colonial que persiste a través de la ocupación de la mente, y nos está comentando, y ser incluso cuando la ocupación de la tierra ha terminado. Nos comparte el profesor Sonn el énfasis de la decolonialidad. No es un movimiento para diluir las luchas, es trabajar juntos, es trabajar muy sensibilizados frente a toda esta colectivo que de alguna manera nos ilustra también Martin Burrow en su ideal. Okay.
Okay. So this is the next slide. So I guess, so that's part of a broader framework for us in terms of thinking about how do we reimagine community and liberation-oriented psychology and its praxis. And this, of course, responds to some of the work that have come from the Latin American context, including the various expressions of liberation theology, sociology, education, the work that of Fals Borda, a Colombian sociologist, and then the way in which this has been written about in liberation psychology. So Martin Baró was critical of psychology and advocated for a new approach with a focus on the needs of people, privileging the voices of people, and constructing psychology from the vantage point of the oppressed or of those below the line of the human. So this is, in some regards, as I read this, it's a way of thinking about psychology from below and reimagining what psychology, how we can engage and mobilize psychology to support the desires, aspirations of people. So for Baró, this is expressed in his idea or his articulation of accompaniment, which is about involving ourselves in a new praxis, new sets of foundations, and activity of transforming reality that will let us know not only about what it is, but what is not, and by which to try and orient towards the what ought to be. So in Baró's work, there's lots of invitations and challenges for us to think about who is psychology for, what is psychology for, because often psychology is about situated in academic spaces and about the reproduction and development of theory and theoretical sorts of models. But this version and this invitation is about a psychology of the everyday and in the everyday. And so we've been thinking about this as a challenge for us as well.
All right. El profesor Sonn nos comparte acerca de Martin Baró, quien fue un crítico con la psicología y abogó por un enfoque centrado en las necesidades de la gente, privilegiando las voces de las personas y construyendo la psicología desde el punto de vista de los oprimidos. Nos invita a reimaginar futuros en Latinoamérica a través de esta psicología de la liberación, pero más aún nos reta acerca de ese rol que debe o debería nos debería hacer pensarnos desde la liberación y desde ese enfoque de la psicología de la liberación que nos muestra Martín Baró, en articular esas praxis y la teoría frente a la realidad, en elementos clave como la educación, como la sociología y cómo movilizar todos estos elementos en nuestros contextos latinoamericanos. Go ahead.
Okay, next. Okay, so for me, some of the work and some of the way that we have been trying to imagine a new praxis has come out of our partnerships with different social organizations, including agencies that work with a methodology called community arts practice. And I think in Latin America, it's not called community arts practice, or it's arts for justice, I think, or social art, arte de social, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So community arts as a practice shares with liberation and community psychology the principles of participation, of inclusion, and is open and is fairly pragmatic in terms of embracing creative methods. So the traditional methods of surveys and interviews, it goes beyond that, because we're interested in creating spaces for participation, and in those dialogue and critical engagement is central. So community arts as a method and as a methodology lends itself to this notion of accompaniment. So research practice as imagined by people in liberation-oriented psychology or critical community psychology is thinking about how do we as researchers, as practitioners or as actors, accompany the different communities that we want to support in their struggles. And so this is not so much a question of whether we abandon psychology, but it's a question about whether psychological knowledge will be placed in the service of constructing society where the welfare of the few is not built on the wretchedness of the many, where the fulfillment of some does not require the others to be deprived, where the interests of minority do not demand the dehumanization of all. So this is about, and again, for us, this is an invitation to think about the sorts of ways in which research can be part of the process of action, or participatory, action-oriented, and so forth. But the idea of research as accompaniment is very much in our imagination as we try to do the work in partnership with the different agencies in our communities. Okay, Beth.
Okay, Professor. That's so interesting, Professor. Bueno, en este sentido, el profesor Sonn nos comparte acerca de su experiencia de práctica en cuanto al arte comunitario, a esta práctica artística comunitaria que se articula con la liberación y los principios de la psicología comunitaria, con la participación, con la inclusión y con todos esos elementos que son adoptados por métodos creativos en el proceso de diálogo. Son elementos clave para el diálogo, para el proceso de deconstrucción y reconstrucción de este tipo de comunidades, pero nos llama más allá a reflexionar frente a cómo nosotros desde nuestros roles de investigadores acompañamos a estas comunidades a construirse y a reconstruirse en cuanto al bienestar de unos pocos para un bienestar común y la deshumanización de los demás. Go ahead.
Okay, where are we? Next one, please. Okay, so what I will do now is provide some examples that of the work that we have been doing with different groups. And so the first one will be with a group of young people who are mostly, I think all of them are from the African diaspora. Some grew up here and some were born here with their parents. So the example that I have here is called AMCA, and this is Narratives from the African Diaspora. This is a project that was designed and developed by, I think, two of the people in this image, Maz, as a response, I guess, to some of the sorts of misrepresentations and homogenizing representations of what it means to be African in the Australian context. And those representations are often depicted as in fairly negative sorts of ways. And part of what these young people wanted to do was to tell their stories of migration, of belonging, and of identity. And the way in which they did this was to develop over time, to do intergenerational storytelling, but also to tell their own stories, and then to tell their stories about what it means to be third culture. So in between home and the new culture, but also the opportunities that happens for them as they create new ways of being based on their lived experiences, which includes racism, but includes also retrieving memory, building stories, sharing stories about being young people. So they created and produced this show or this play called AMCA, and the concept of AMCA means to rise up, to stand up, to take responsibility. So it is a stirring and a sort of a way of them to become active and agentic in telling stories about themselves that should be circulating in public as opposed to the dominant community stories. So that's the first part, Yvette, the aim, and then I'll go across the slide from aim to sources and to what we've learned.
Okay, Professor. Okay, Professor. Para la audiencia, el profesor Sonn nos acaba de compartir acerca de este interesante proyecto que se llevó a cabo a partir de las narrativas de la diáspora africana. Un grupo, un colectivo de migrantes africanos del cual él es individuo y participante de esa diáspora africana. Entonces se tomaron el rol de escucharse, de construir, de también iniciar sus prácticas experienciales en cuanto al arte, y no solo compartieron historias acerca de sus experiencias, sino también formaron otro tipo de historias a partir de sus realidades anteriores. No se trataba de crear este colectivo con el ánimo meramente artístico, sino también una reconstrucción de su individualidad para tomar responsabilidades y para levantar su voz en cuanto a su ser.
So, no, not yet. So, Yvette, did you say, so our role in some of this work is that we do accompany the young people in their stories. As researchers, we have brought into conversation the concepts and ideas and methods for documenting their experiences, for documenting what it is that they produce, and to ask questions about how the work that they do together, the settings that they create together, to digest their stories, to make sense of their stories and the way in which they then elevate these stories into the public sphere, and then to also ask questions about how are those stories received in the public sphere by the different audiences who engage with or receive the stories that they tell about their lives and their experiences. So the research is in itself becomes a new setting that we create that sits in between arts for creativity, but arts and arts practice as an intervention into the social, and as an intervention that provides a space for people to participate in what Gergen and others call world making. So we would be in traditional sorts of approaches, we talk about participant observation, we would use surveys, we would use interviews, but we would also be interested in the artifacts that they produce, the videos that they produce, the arts that they produce, and to understand those, not those as cultural products that allows us to gain insight into the mechanisms through which young people are supporting each other, collectivizing, and then acting on the world. Does that make sense, Yvette? Yeah.
Too much sense, Professor.
Okay.
Nos comparte el profesor Sonn que en este proyecto no solamente se llevaron a cabo estas prácticas colectivas, sino también que en el proyecto de investigación, se implementó la participación colectiva, la observación, unas entrevistas, y los videos generados por estos colectivos han sido documentados. Toda esta parte después de que el grupo tuvo sus intervenciones a través de sus presentaciones, entonces también ese trabajo se ha documentado y el profesor Sonn ha estado extendiendo esos elementos y ha estado recalcando esos elementos como parte fundamental de su trabajo de investigación.
Yeah. Oh, not yet. Not yet. So the last part of this slide is that, so when we think about accompaniment as researchers, we are not outsiders to the journey that the young people undertake in acting on the world and producing new narratives and new ways in which they themselves want to assert their agency, but in controlling also what circulates about them. So the concepts that we've been drawing from include some of the writing from arts, from decolonial literature. So this notion of wide awakeness is about expanding people's understanding of the presence of others. I think it comes from Maxine Green, an American educationalist and philosopher. The notion of aesthetic distance is about how do we actually reduce the space between Black experience and other diaspora's experiences, because typically when people experience and witness someone else's story, they might say that, well, I didn't know. And so part of this concept is, how does arts informed practice reduce the distance between different communities of people in the Australian context? The other concept that we've engaged with here, which I think resonates with pluriversality, or expanding our sorts of boundaries, so we don't have homogeneous understanding, but we're witnessing the complexity and the multiple subjectivities that young people from the African diaspora that present in their own lives. And then the other part of this is that it's not only their experiences and the complexity of their experiences, it's also the way in which these experiences provides insight into the essentializing, homogenizing effects of white supremacy or whiteness. Yeah? So there's an internal dialogue that that shows the complexity of African belonging, African identities. But then there's also the outwardly facing dialogue that is about challenges, the sorts of narratives that impact upon them. And that's typically shaped through whiteness as a form of coloniality. Okay, Yvette.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Algunas fuentes del análisis que nos acaba de compartir el profesor son parte del trabajo que él ha estado realizando con este colectivo y nos está enfatizando en los efectos y la complejidad que lleva este tipo de proyectos. La parte nuclear de este concepto es reducir la distancia, nos acaba de compartir el profesor Sonn, reducir la distancia entre ese reconocimiento de derechos entre comunidades de diversos backgrounds, de diversos orígenes. Nos está también, nos está también haciendo énfasis en los mecanismos de cambio que ellos han implementado en esta parte y recalca, nos enfatiza en cuanto a tener un conocimiento bastante amplio del colectivo, de las necesidades como observadores mucho más que unos investigadores con el rol de investigadores es un poco más de acompañamiento y de evidenciar esas...
Ni le digo lo carísimo.
No había neutro.
Hola.
Ya me contestó.
Hola. Gracias. Okay, go ahead, Professor.
We can go to the next slide now, Maria. So I'm not going to show the link here, but if people want to, they can go to that link. But this is just one of the comments or one of the reflective comments that people offered about what it means for them to participate and to produce narratives about their own lives that can be elevated. And so one of the leaders of this group says that for her, the platform for herself and others to represent themselves the way that they needed to and wanted to be is important. Being able to recenter African narratives in a way that created a journey of reflection and critical conversations. We weren't continuing the same narrative of the African diaspora that is seen here in Australia, which is underrepresented on many platforms, spoken about out of context and usually given a single narrative. So what they do for themselves is they challenge this idea of a single narrative, but they are also the owners and the authors of the stories that they want to tell about their lives, being in the Australian context as diaspora. And I think in the next example, you will see that what they do and how they actually embrace and retrieve collective memory, the writing and the knowledges embedded in the African archives, and how that gets translated into the Australian context as positive resources for identity and community making. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Nos comparte el profesor Sonn en esta diapositiva acerca de, continuando con las narrativas, un participante de este colectivo, AMCA, el cual hace parte de la diáspora africana, nos dice que para él o para ella fue una plataforma para que esa persona y otros se representara como necesitaban y como querían que fuera a su propia manera de poder volver a centrar la narrativa africana en lo que ellos realmente reflexionan y conversan. De hecho, el profesor Sonn nos indica que al compartir después del evento esta presentación, la audiencia puede acceder a través de este link a las reflexiones de ciertos participantes del colectivo. En la próxima diapositiva vamos entonces a centrarnos acerca de, en un ejemplo de diáspora australiana en la que el profesor Sonn y su equipo ha estado trabajando. Go ahead, professor.
That's just the crew of people there. So you can go to the next slide and I'll talk about this other study quickly and then we can go into the video. So next one, Maria. Oh,
This?
forward. No, forward.
Okay.
Next.
Aquí.
Past. There.
No.
See. Yes. See. Next in color. No.
Next.
Next. See. This one. Okay. So this one. So this same group. So this same group of people. They formed a collective, a coalition, and one of the projects that they started to develop is called Next in Color. So there were six creatives, 6 artists, or 6 people who use art to effect social change. So Next in Color, we've thought of this about enacting an imagination. So the imagination for them is that they wanted to produce work on their terms, by them, for them. So this is how they've come together. And part of the work and the research that we have been doing with them through our process of accompaniment was to actually support, document, and elevate their stories. So this project is the record of a doctoral study that one of my students have just completed based on 3 years or 3.5 years of working with this group to develop insights into their journeys and their experiences and the way in which they want to effect change. So the collective draws on various creative methodologies. Some are poets, some are photographers, some use dance, and some are filmmakers to develop, to organize, and to be active in social change projects by them, for them, and led by them. So the collective is called Next in Color. So a few things that they have done: they've created a film that tells about some of the sorts of violences that they experience, but also that contests those and inserts resources that informs Black identity into everyday stories. So again, for them, the project is about creating settings, creating home places. And in those home places, people have an opportunity to name what it means to live with and experience racism and racialization in everyday settings. But it's equally important for them to be able to come together to support each other and to deconstruct and make sense of their experiences. So these are the sorts of internal dynamics of what it means for them to be in a group, to be in a supportive setting. For them, the ethics of care, the commitment to healing, and to collectively imagine how they can resist and deconstruct narratives is very important. The settings that they create also become very important as a vehicle for counter storytelling. And it's in this particular space that they create and use art to produce counter stories and to elevate those counter stories into the public sphere. So the sorts of stories that one of the examples of storytelling is reflected in a zine, so a magazine that they produce, where they invite people to write about their everyday lives and so forth. So the counter stories are stories about self-love and the love of Black bodies. It's about inserting absences in knowledge. So they will retrieve archives and ancestral memories from home, memories of Fanon's writing, about Steve Biko's writing, and writing that comes from the African diaspora about what it means to be and what it means to be from these communities. And one of the other key aspects of counter storytelling for these young people is, instead of engaging only through this lens of whiteness that is so dominant and over-determining, their turn is towards indigeneity and indigenous sovereignty. And part of their response is to think about and to understand their belonging from the perspective of indigenous sovereignty. And this is an extremely important turn because it's not one that is a response to white racism. It is an investment and understanding in indigenous conceptions of the world, indigenous understandings of land, indigenous understandings of country, but also what it means for us to be responsible to and responsive to Aboriginal struggles for self-determination. Okay, then.
Yes. Ok, Profesor. El segundo proyecto que el profesor Sonn nos ha significado tiene como nombre Next in Color. Es un colectivo del cual hacen parte 6 participantes, todos muy comprometidos con la parte del arte. Algunos danzan, algunos son fotógrafos, otros escriben. Su objetivo principal es participar en este proyecto de cambio social, que promueve un cambio social verdadero, el cual tiene como propósito la creación de espacios, y la creación de espacios para apoyarse entre ellos, entre esas mismas comunidades, entre las comunidades en Australia, las cuales han sido vulneradas y se están tomando esta parte de colectivos a través de arte, recreando sus recuerdos ancestrales. Y nos comenta el profesor Sonn que no solamente esta teorización debe ser vista desde la imaginación, sino también desde la teorización, y nos habla acerca de la teorización y los mecanismos de cambio, como la creación de entornos en estos lugares de vida, para nombrar algunas manifestaciones de racismo, de construcción de este tipo de experiencias vividas, de cuidado y de curación y resistencia. Nos resalta el profesor Sonn que al contar sus propias historias a través de las artes es un método, o ha sido un método bastante constructivo para los participantes del proyecto. Incluso los archivos y, como les comenté, las memorias ancestrales que los logran centrar en esa soberanía indígena y aborigen.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor.
Next one. Okay, so this is just an example of how people have talked about what participation in this project means for them. The quote is very, very dense, but it gives you the sense that and I think this creating a space is the important concept and the principles that they have articulated for how they want to be in a space together. So I'll just start in the middle here. So we are creating a space where you can be vulnerable and where you can deconstruct stuff for yourself. You're understanding your own biases and stuff like that. Understanding your own internalized racism or internalized disconnect to others and the stuff like that based on what colonialism or white supremacy has told you to feel about this particular group of people or this community. I think the importance of the space is just like you have to have your own room in a house. You can't just live in the living room all the time because everybody's always there and everybody's always putting their own thing there. Have your own spaces, like you just declutter. So this is a really important space because I think one of the key things is that people have an opportunity to rehumanize, yep, or to claim forms of re-existence, to understand white supremacy and how it gets under the skin, but then also to reimagine and to reconnect with African ancestral knowledges and other lived experiences. So it's not just a project of past retrieval, but it's a project that is about future making, and art becomes the vehicle through which they actually are able to engage in that future making for themselves, and then making that available to wider groups. Okay, that's the last one on this.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Nos remarca en esta diapositiva el profesor Sonn la creación de espacios. La creación de espacios no solamente permiten que sean creados colectivamente por la comunidad, por esta misma comunidad, en un espacio donde no sean vulnerados. Un elemento clave que nos está recalcando el profesor Sonn en la deconstrucción de la colonialización, en términos de rehumanizar y reimaginar esas experiencias que se han vivido en colectivo para determinar un futuro, y un futuro en cuanto a esas realidades y a lo que se ha explorado a través del arte. Nos menciona que el arte definitivamente es el canal para lograr esa rehumanización. Okay, Professor.
Okay, Maria. Is it Maria? Yeah. Okay, so this is just one of the photos that Iselden, who's one of the artists in here, he created an exhibition based on photos that he took in Sudan, and then that he brought home to represent his own journey of migration, of memory, and of survival in the Australian context. And so it's a very personal story, but it's also a very collective story that gets made available to the public, and then public engages. So this is the way in which the counter storytelling from lived experience gets made visible or objectified, materialized through arts, then for others to engage with and respond to. And then we go to the next one.
Yvette,
I don't, yeah. Is Yvette still there?
I am here. I am here. Okay. Yes. Ok, el profesor nos está compartiendo esta fotografía como materialización de sobrevivientes de migración, los cuales son originarios de Sudán. Es una materialización que ha ayudado en el proceso y le parece bastante importante traer la colación a esta presentación y a este evento. Gracias.
Okay. So the next, other way, Yvette, other way, Maria. See, Yvette, can you just say that the next one moves from the African diaspora, but also then starts to introduce a project that we have been working on in partnership with Aboriginal colleagues at Victoria University. And part of what we are interested in is really to understand the way in which coloniality or racialization impacts upon those who are racialized, but also to make visible whiteness as an absent category in the process of racialization. So we're very much interested in that dialogue of what are the sorts of spaces that we can create where, as that other example shows, where people do get to understand white supremacy as people of color, but also as white people who come into these spaces where they want to collaborate and do the work of accompaniment. And yep, and then once you've done that, then Maria can play this video.
Focused on Aboriginal country. And our first speaker today, very fittingly, is Paola. who's speaking to us about connecting Aboriginal women to country. Thanks, Paola.
Thank you, Donna. I'm assuming I can start now. Thank you. Hello. As Donna said, I'm Paola Balla. I am a Wemba Bangunditj Mara woman from Moondani, Balluk at Victoria University, and I acknowledge our sovereign, unceded Bunurong and Wurundjeri country, people and ancestors where I present from, and acknowledge the multiple sovereign Aboriginal standpoints embodied at Moondani Balluk and how we respond and critique the planetary health frameworks. Our research team is made up of some incredible people: Karen Jackson, Christopher Sonn, Amy Quayle and Rowena Price. If I can go to the first slide, please, of continuity of lockdown. During lockdown, Margie Tang, Wemba elder, was interviewed as saying that Aboriginal people have been in lockdown since colonisation. Complex issues facing Aboriginal communities stem from transgenerational traumas and ongoing structural violence caused by colonisation. COVID lockdowns highlighted these traumas. Aboriginal people in the Western Melbourne expressed a desire to understand the impact of dispossession and dispersal on identity and community connection. By strengthening protective factors and minimising risk factors, Aboriginal families and communities can be supported to stay strong and stay together to work towards breaking the cycle of intergenerational traumas. This research focuses on Aboriginal women in Melbourne's West, responding to risk factors by enhancing and building protective factors of social connectedness and cultural knowledge through connecting with country. If I can go to the next slide, thank you. Our Indigenous-led project responded to Aboriginal women in Melbourne's West desires to connect with country, culture and community. Indigenous-led research as a decolonial practice responds to the needs of community rather than being driven by a method, with reciprocity and nurturing at the core of this project. Our participatory methods were WAPA work, an Aboriginal cultural immersion program facilitated by Yorta Yorta practitioner Rowena Price, holding concepts of country, self, yarning, body movement, moving meditation for 6 weekly sessions. We then paused and reflected, and our next process was bush dyeing workshops that I facilitated over 6 weekly sessions. This included the women gathering small amounts of native plants from within the allowed 5K COVID limit by walking on country. The plants were used to print and colour calico and silk with. Workshops were conducted over Zoom over this 3-month span with 3-hour weekly sessions, sometimes adjusted depending on the women's wishes and well-being. Sessions created space for women to yarn about history, everyday life, culture, country, and identity connections. Each session began with an acknowledgement of country, a welcome to country by traditional owners within the group, and based on deep listening, yarning and sharing before business began. Our data collections involved a process that's been collective, storytelling, sharing, understandings, lived experiences, plant gathering, image and note sharing, observations, responses, and deep listening. In slide 9, in growing strength and relationship, is where we look at what our key findings are so far, and they are deeply based on our relationships and the notion of relationality, which is key to understanding our processes and findings. The intergenerational wrapping around is about the connection between the varying ages and experiences of the women in the group, a safe and supportive place, a healing space. Caring for country embodied the notion of a new and renewed sense of embodied awareness from looking and engaging on country through the project, and women observing climate change during COVID and post the bushfires earlier in the year. Cultural connection, cultural renewal and cultural reclamation drew on ancestral knowledge and contemporary practices and drew from past and present. Identity was about naming, claiming and remembering the oppression and growing strong in identity, which is often tested by society for proud Aboriginal women in growing and dealing with shame associated with identity if you don't stereotypically look Black or Aboriginal. In slide 5, our final one, gathering in place, on country and in person. The projects demonstrated the importance of Indigenous-led approaches and the need for culturally safe spaces. It's already been impactful in the lives of the women who participated. It's brought them together for meaningful social connection and acknowledged pre-COVID and COVID-enforced cultural isolation. The project will be expanded in 2021 to include new groups of women, including incarcerated Aboriginal women and those at risk, and service providers with the support of an IATSIS Indigenous Research Grant. Another impact will be increasing service providers' understandings of social and emotional wellbeing and practices that either support or undermine wellbeing. The aim of this project is to strengthen Aboriginal and social and emotional wellbeing, to empower families and communities and help break the cycle of intergenerational traumas. The groups plan to gather in place, on country, in person together at the Witwatersrand Centre at Werribee, where the project was meant to take place pre-COVID. Thank you.
Well done, Paola. What a
Okay, can go to the next one now. Okay, so Yvette, did you want to say something about that video? I know it was really fast.
I know, Professor Sonn, but would you like maybe to highlight certain elements from maybe from the video, from the audio, some elements
Yes.
that would you like to highlight?
I think so. Did you get a sense of what it was, or did you want me to say?
Maybe as a summary, that could be fine.
Yeah. So this video is a project that is led by Indigenous women. The key cultural practices that they have used is called Waihapa work, which is based on Aboriginal understandings of culture, of place, and of healing, and it's an embodied arts practice. The other practice is called bush dyeing, and is informed by Paola, who is an Indigenous cultural worker, artist, academic, and scholar. And so again, as in the other arts projects that we've done, arts becomes the mediating tool. But in this case, the arts practice is informed and located in Aboriginal mythologies, conceptions of country, of land. It shifts away from Eurocentric, individualistic, biomedical understandings of country, of place, but it centers the relationality and the relationship between and the interconnectedness of people with country. And country is a very important way of thinking about belonging, place, health, and well-being for Aboriginal people. And dispossession from country is one of the key mechanisms that have contributed to the exclusion and oppression of Indigenous people in Australia. So for us as researchers, and again, through practices of accompaniment, it's about how do we create spaces for recentering Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being, and at the same time, how do we understand and decenter Eurocentric understandings of people, place, and country. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. En resumen, el video anterior hace parte de un proyecto, el segundo proyecto que nos comparte hoy el profesor Sonn, acerca de mujeres indígenas, un colectivo de mujeres indígenas de Australia, del cual hace parte la profesora y la artista Paola Balluk. Esa comprensión de lo ancestral, de lo indígena, es el foco de atención de esta investigación en cuanto a conocer la concepción y la percepción de la tierra desde esa cosmovisión y desde esa conceptualización aborigen e indígena que se tiene con este colectivo. Nos menciona las perspectivas en cuanto a la opresión en Australia y cómo a través de esas prácticas artísticas muy tradicionales de esas comunidades indígenas se logra llegar a una liberación, a una sanación colectiva a través de ese proyecto y de esa práctica. También nos menciona que se preguntan siempre en sus roles de investigadores el cómo centrarse ellos y cómo contextualizar, cómo comprender esa parte de la opresión y la discriminación en cuanto a estas comunidades. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so those are the examples. So I've taken the liberty of using the concept of border arts, border methods that you have for this series to say that part of what we are trying to do here is this response, is advancing approaches and methods that elevate the lived concerns and pedagogical imperatives of freedom, anguish, responsibility, embodied agency, sociality, and liberation. As we think about and think through our practice and reflect on our praxis, we distill particular sorts of points that we need to be open to the voices of different groups, to value their lived experiences and the ways in which they know and act in the world. It is extremely important to understand our locus of enunciation, the places that we speak from, our situated subjectivities and positionalities as researchers, as people, as colleagues, as friends, but in a broader context of a global history, because we have got the circuits of coloniality that flows through and that is expressed in the global South and its relationships to the global North. In our everyday practices, the epistemology or the episteme of relatedness that is so central to liberation psychology, but is so central to indigenous, feminist, and other practices. We center that because we center dialogue and we center relational ethics and relational epistemes. It is important for us to embrace not knowing, to be open and to participate in constructing new ways in which we can mobilize liberation and community and critical community-oriented psychologies. Yvette, that one, and then we've got one last slide.
Ok, profesor. Nos comparte el profesor Sonn que el avanzar en enfoques y métodos que eleven las preocupaciones vividas y los imperativos pedagógicos de la libertad, de la angustia, de la responsabilidad, la socialidad y la liberación. También nos habla acerca de la práctica decolonial orientada a la liberación, pero ¿qué significa y qué nos enfoca en este momento el profesor Sonn? A estar de alguna manera abierto a las voces de los diferentes grupos, a valorar sus experiencias vividas y las formas en que se conocen y actúan en el mundo, en sus propios mundos también. Entender también nuestro lugar de enunciación en el contexto de la historia global. También promover una ética y una epistemología y ser tolerantes con la ambigüedad. Okay,
next
professor.
slide. Yep. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so I think that's almost it for me. I think a couple of things here, and I think maybe the main point for me, from my perspective and in my context, is that I can, and we always look to use our privilege as academics, as scholars, to create spaces within and outside the university. Because in the Australian context, the university still and is also a place of colonialism and coloniality. But we need to understand and understand different people's experiences in these places and how best we can create spaces of safety, spaces that's nurturing of the cultural identities that needs to be strengthened and can be strengthened rather than eroded and diminished because of the ongoing ways in which coloniality expresses itself in current times. People are writing about intersectionality and the different ways in which structures continue to impact on people's lives. And for responsive and responsible is community critical psychologies, there is an imperative to understand, I think, what Nelson Maldonado Torres has recently written about and thinks about forms of psychology and social sciences that will tackle the various metaphysical catastrophes, the sorts of ways in which categories, structures continue to impact upon people's lives. And I think that's a fairly exciting and important challenge, but it's also the one that liberation theorists have put out, that scholars like Fanon, Biko and others have long argued and theorized about. And so it's those very theorists who become very important resources as we imagine the world in this very tricky and difficult times. Thank you.
Ok, el profesor Sonn nos comparte las conclusiones muy personales. Nos estaba comentando que desde su perspectiva personal siempre ha visto ese privilegio de educación que se tiene desde la universidad en Australia. Nos comparte también de ese impacto, ese rol que tiene él y que siente él en impactar otras vidas, pues la vida de otras personas. Dice que es un imperativo constante, no solamente para el resto de comunidades, sino para nosotros y nosotras, las investigadoras y los investigadores. También resalta a dos escritores teóricos, Maldonado y Torres. Nos está significando también el profesor Sonn de la importancia de esas teorías, pero cómo también articular las teorías con otro tipo de alternativas, con otro tipo de opciones que pueden ser documentadas así como él lo ha documentado y como sus compañeros, colegas lo han documentado en ciertos proyectos. Ok, profesor.
That's it for me, Yvette, I think. Thank you for doing all of that interpretation of those slides. It's, I really appreciate that. But that's it. I don't know if people have questions or comments, or if we have time for that.
Let me ask, Professor. John Gregory, el profesor Sonn quisiera conocer si existen algunas inquietudes al respecto.
Sí, bueno, al profesor Sonn, muchísimas gracias. La maestra Caterine tiene una pregunta. Entonces, adelante, maestra.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. Lo que veo es que, en efecto, la perspectiva desde donde se trabaja con los pueblos indígenas y afro en Australia no dista de lo que estamos haciendo acá en América Latina y el Caribe. Creo que hay mucha proximidad. Me surgieron algunas dudas. Una primera, no sé si profesora Ivette me puede apoyar y ir traduciendo.
Profesora Caterine.
Sí. Gracias. Bueno, y la duda es esta, sí. Hay un planteamiento decolonial del saber a partir de esas prácticas con pueblos indígenas y originarios. Pero, ¿qué nueva teoría y conceptos se han producido para la psicología social comunitaria a partir de estas experiencias que buscan la decolonización de la disciplina? Esa es una.
Okay. Professor Sonn, the professor Caterine has a very, very deep question. Could you please help us?
Oh, yeah, I can try.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So, well, in her perspective, she thinks that according to what is being done in other parts of the world, as you said before, what we are doing here in Latin America is not that far away. So we're very close in terms of praxis, maybe what is being doing through the time, right?
Yes.
Now, in terms of decolonialism, she wants to know what maybe the new concepts, the new theories are helping or are trying to arouse, you know, as a result of this work that you have been doing, or coming from your work?
New theories.
Exactly, new theories.
So I think, look, firstly, I agree very much that the forms of praxis is not so far, and I think partly because so much of the Latin American influences, theoretical conceptual influences, have been taken up in the North and recirculated through recirculated globally. So whether you think about Freire or Dussel or all sorts of other scholars, yeah. So the fact that there's praxis from these spaces that are being translated and taken up in different parts of the world is probably not surprising, but I think we owe a debt also to the fact that so much of the critical writing and the solidarity approaches that we've developed emerges from there. The ideas about whether it's new theories or new ways of repackaging older work is probably going to be my response. It's not so much that there's new theory. It's not so much that there's going to be the new sorts of theories, but I think it's for us, it's the reconnection and recentering of indigenous informed, I guess it would be epistemologies on ontologies. So these are very much relational. They center Earth, they center the connectedness between people, humans and non-humans. It's not a post-humanist sort of thinking, but it is a recentering of conceptions that is about humanizing. I think for me also it is, and I think the language again that comes from the Latin American space would be they are solidarity oriented approaches, yeah. And it's not so much about for us, and I think in our own writing it is ways of understanding the everyday, or the praxis and practices in the everyday. So the shift is a shift away from psychology for theorizing, but a psychology of producing a psychology in partnership and with people in the everyday. So the coordinates, the coordinates that we are drawing on is what is shifting the way that's what is shifting how we go about producing the new. I guess maybe it's not so much the new, but maybe it is the new, but it's I don't think it's about, for us it's like producing new theories. I think we've got different coordinates from which we are producing psychology, I think, put it that way. Does that make sense, Yvette?
Okay, thank you, Professor Sonn. Catherine, do you have any additional question?
Bueno, tengo otra pregunta.
Ok, entonces antes de la siguiente pregunta, ¿deseas entonces que te interprete acerca de la respuesta del profesor? Ok.
Gracias.
El profesor nos está centrando su respuesta en la reconexión y la refocalización en términos de entender ese cambio. Nos habla de las coordenadas que han logrado esos cambios de percepciones, esos cambios de mentalidades, esos cambios a través de las experiencias contenidas en sus prácticas. Más allá de unas nuevas teorías, de nuevos enfoques, están en la exploración y en la práctica real documentada con sus comunidades. Catherine.
Ok, gracias. A ver, el caso mexicano las intelectuales como movimiento, específicamente, por ejemplo, el comunalismo oaxaqueño.
Oops.
En este sentido, han buscado reivindicar.
Discúlpame, profesora Catherine, no te escuchamos bien. ¿Podrías, por favor, repetir tu pregunta?
Ya, sí. En México tenemos movimientos de intelectuales indígenas, como es el caso del comunalismo oaxaqueño, quienes han visibilizado el epistemicidio. En ese sentido, digamos que han forjado que contienden con, digamos, el grupo, por decir, de intelectuales acá en México, ¿no? Mi pregunta es a que si en Australia, si bien él se está reivindicando como diáspora africana, pero quisiera saber si es algo solo del profesor Sonn o si hay un movimiento social de afro-australianos o de indígenas australianos intelectuales, ¿sí?, que asuman esta posición y estén generando cambios, ¿sí?, dentro de la academia.
Okay. Professor Sonn.
Mm-hmm.
The Professor Catherine, she would like to know if maybe in Australia, is it any Afro-Australian movement of academics that are working on a real shift? Do you know why? Because she has given us a real context in Oaxaca, which is a land in a territory up there in Mexico, you know, and they have an indigenous academic group.
Yes. So yes. So yeah, in Australia, there's on next week, I'm going to attend the Native American and Indigenous Academics Association's regional meeting in Queensland. So there's a lot of indigenous academics at different universities, and this will be one of the places where the Australian and New Zealand Maori academics will be coming together. There's two key things that I can probably highlight. So there is in Victoria, where I live and work at the moment, there's a leading activist scholars who are organizing a program of activity called the Aboriginal History Archive. And so this is an archive of activist work led by Indigenous academics. So people are organizing around this archive to retrieve the knowledge base and to organize around this knowledge base as part of the process of Indigenous self-determination. The other example would be the work that is led by Professor Pat Dudgeon, who is a leading Indigenous psychologist in Australia. And the program of work that she is leading and developing focuses on developing a responsive and culturally anchored psychology around the concepts of social emotional well-being, which is an Indigenous articulation of well-being rooted in Aboriginal conceptions of land. So that program of work is led by them, but it's also a national program that is now being used to guide the way in which psychology training programs will be transformed so that they can be more responsive. So those are two, I guess they're two examples of some local work that is happening, but then also some work at the national national level that is psychology specific, but then also work that is wider and broader than psychology, focused on the role of Aboriginal sovereignty and the various projects that people are developing to elevate Aboriginal people's perspectives towards self-determination. At the same time, in Victoria, we have got a truth-telling commission that is led by Aboriginal people, First Nations people at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Profesora Caterine, el profesor Sonn nos comparte su respuesta frente a su interesante inquietud. Esta vez nos comparte de dos ejemplos de comunidades, de grupos aborígenes, el cual está conformado por académicos indígenas directamente desde Australia, Queensland. De hecho, la próxima semana el profesor va a participar de un evento académico con estos grupos. De hecho, nos nombra uno a ARCA, right, Professor?
Archivo.
Can you please spell it for me?
ARKA. Oops, no, I put it in the chat.
Thank you, Professor.
Archive. Museum, memory, memoria.
Okay, so ARKA?
No, hold on. I'll find it here. Archive. What the hell is English now? What can I say? I should have known what archive is. Archi. Okay, here we go. Archivo. See?
Okay, our archivo. Okay, could you please post it on the chat so everybody could maybe look for it?
It's in the chat. Yeah, it's in the chat already.
All right, thank you so much, Professor. So, Profesora Catherine, el profesor Sonn nos está compartiendo a través del chat para nuestro conocimiento, entonces, el nombre del colectivo indígena académico, pero quiere resaltar también el programa a nivel no solamente local. Él tiene unos ejemplos que nos acaba de compartir a nivel local, sino también a un nivel nacional. Tienen diferentes programas. La universidad, precisamente Victoria, está liderando un programa de visualización en cuanto a sus perspectivas aborígenes e indígenas. Profesora Caterine.
Gracias. No sé, doctor John, si hay alguna otra pregunta.
Sí, hay una pregunta en el chat. Hay una pregunta en el chat para que ves si la puedes, es de parte de Verónica Luna, para ver si le puedes apoyar.
Okay, Yvette. So for that one, for that one, there's lots of changes that happens for the young people. So partly the opportunity for them to deconstruct race and racism, but then also to develop their skills, their competencies, to be able to act in these industries where they work. The challenges that they do face is ongoing racism. They structural challenges sometimes, but they're also challenges that's related to how people view their capacity to do things, and that whether they will be able to do things. For example, we've got examples of where people don't support them because they fear what it would mean when lots of Black people come together to gather. So one of the things that I often challenge is that whenever we work with migrant communities or with Black people, Indigenous people, there's often an assumption of a lack of competency or a deficit orientation. So part of the work that I do and part of what we focus on is to raise questions about where those assumptions come from, but then also to say that what are the starting points? What are the aspirations and what are the desires and what are the structures and the discourses that gets in the way of the work that they want to do. And so often the work that we have to do is not on changing or fixing the young people, it's on shifting and changing the assumptions in the institutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Let me highlight your words, please. El profesor Sonn nos acaba de compartir acerca de esas estructuras que se trabajan, esas prácticas que se trabajan en los colectivos de los proyectos en los cuales él ha trabajado, y nos ha compartido acerca, la última parte sobre todo, que no se trata de reparar esas emocionalidades, sino de cambiar perspectivas, de cambiar y de lograr un cambio a nivel de postura en estos migrantes y las personas que hacen parte de estos proyectos. No solamente documentan como investigadores todos los procesos socioemocionales, sino también sus deseos, y maximizan y potencializan, se encargan también de potencializar sus talentos, sus habilidades, que les ayudan en cuanto a todo ese proceso de renovación. I would like to share with you, Professor Sonn, one of the questions that has been posted in the chat, please. It was by Veronica Luna. Can you please check it out? It's in Spanish, but I'm going to translate it for you. Professor, could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just
All right.
I'm just checking out Veronica's question.
Okay, the first thing she says is thank you very much, Professor Sonn. Very interesting, your work. Carry on with AMCA youngers, yes, young people, and next in color young people, right? And she would like to know about changes that you have observed in them.
Okay, so maybe one anecdote. One in the early days of working with this group of young people, one of the things that happened for them, and that I guess that I'm part of this conversation, is that they actually traveled. They traveled to participate in a workshop, a decolonizing workshop. Yep. And when they returned from this workshop, the change that happened for them is that they shifted, they digested what it means to think from a decolonial framework, but they also shifted their focus to say that they want to have resources to be able to present themselves. Yeah? They shifted a dependency relationship that they had with the organization that supported them to say that instead of other people representing them or producing art or facilitating, that they want to be in control of and in charge of setting their visions. That was probably the most profound shift that has happened for them. And since that time and since that particular point, it's always been about asserting and claiming their agency, so that they can authorize and write their destinies and their future. So that was probably the most profound shift. And all of this work that's gotten to Next in Color emanated from that particular moment of people being able to be in charge and responsible for the stories that they want to tell about themselves. So that was the key thing. And the other things that have happened since that time is that they've articulated what it means for them to operate from and think from a decolonial African-centered standpoint. And so those are probably the most profound and the most important shifts that I've observed for them. That's the first part of the question, I think.
Yes, Professor. Yes, let me say to Veronica what you said, right?
Yes.
Verónica, el profesor nos responde acerca de tu inquietud que no solamente los participantes de Ankara y de Next Color viajaron y participaron del taller, sino que el más profundo cambio que él pudo observar en estos dos colectivos es acerca de, estos participantes se enfocaron en el cambio que se representaban a ellos mismos. Entonces, el cambio surgió en cuanto al marco de la decolonización, cuando ellos ya compartieron en sí o entre sí este tipo de representaciones, lograron una concepción de presentarse, de representación a ellos mismos sin tener el control de otros o de otras comunidades ni de otras personas. Además, encontró otro cambio bastante profundo y es articular sus percepciones como colectivo. La identificación de esas percepciones como colectivo fue lo que el profesor observó mayoritariamente. Professor Sonn, the next part of the question
was about, so the next part of the question, I think, is, I don't know if it's my process of deconstruction or if it's the group together. I was unclear about that second part, but I'm clear about the obstacles.
Ok, so, el profesor no tiene muy claro ese proceso de deconstrucción, si lo habla desde la perspectiva muy personal de él o como el colectivo del que él nos está exponiendo, pero le gustaría al profesor enfocarse en los obstáculos en los que él se ha enfrentado al llevar a cabo estos proyectos. Ok, go ahead, professor.
Okay, so I guess, I mean, the process, for me, the process of deconstruction has always been about how we understand the way in which race and racialization gets under our skin. Yeah? And so deconstruction is about really understanding the way in which structures operate, yeah? and to deconstruct the ideology of race culture or racialized culture. That has been my own journey, and my own journey has informed the way in which I translate pedagogical practices into the research accompaniment process that we have here. And often it's about problematization. Yeah? So it's the quintessential liberation framing of what is the problem, not who is the problem, what is the problem. The obstacles that the group continue to face are ones that relates to the way in which race and whiteness, or a particular type of ignorance, a blindness to difference, yeah, that influences their relationship with structures, with community settings, with policymakers, and with funders, because that relationship is always philanthropic. It's not decolonial or emancipatory. And part of what we have to always work on is to develop the ways in which we can also, I don't know if we can shift the philanthropy's perspectives towards decoloniality, because that's the power that they have and they call the shots. But those are the key obstacles. Yeah, the key obstacles are always expressed through an ignorance that sits within the mainstream services and systems. Does that make sense, Yvette? Yeah.
Sure, Professor. Ok, Verónica, el profesor nos ha querido dar un poquito más de elementos frente a la última parte de tu pregunta. Nos dice que uno de los obstáculos, se nos comparte acerca de los obstáculos, es cómo entender esas perspectivas, cómo lograr reconocer esas influencias de las estructuras y cómo operan esas estructuras. Cómo lograr deconstruir aquellas estructuras dependiendo de sus contextos y las influencias y las políticas que se han empleado a través de esas estructuras. Uno de los mayores obstáculos nos menciona la ignorancia de todo el articulado, de todo este sistema, pero también nos habla de la deconstrucción a nivel simbólico, a nivel colectivo, pero sobre todo de cómo entender, sí remarca el cómo entender ellos desde sus percepciones, esas concepciones y esas realidades. Ok, profesor.
Ok. Si me permite, bueno, como ya son las 8 de pronto para ir cerrando, no sé si la profe María del Pilar, la profe Caterine tengan algo más para el profesor.
Pues nada, yo creo que más bien en esta idea de diálogo, decirle al profesor que si al contrario, él tiene alguna pregunta para nosotros y nosotras, porque siempre, bueno, en estas conferencias son preguntas, pero también él debe tener sus inquietudes, ¿no? Entonces, ¿tiene él alguna inquietud para nosotros? ¿Alguna pregunta?
Profesor Sonn, sí, Caterine, continúa, tranquila.
No, es que tenías el micrófono cerrado.
Ok, gracias. Okay, Professor Sonn, John Gregory said that it's about 8 p.m. here in this part of the world, of the planet, right?
Yes.
Okay, so, but Catherine, maybe she has the possibility to ask you about if you have any question for us, for them, for the audience.
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, the key question for me, I've always been interested in my trips and travels to Latin America. I had always been interested in knowing more about indigenous and indigenizing psychology, but also the history and contributions of the African diaspora to the Latin American ways of being, doing, and knowing. And so to know about this project, as for me, is like, I know it's extremely exciting, and I would love to be able to know more about how it develops. Yeah, so that's maybe more of a comment than a question, and I'd be more than open to, I don't know, to connect and share the sorts of, I don't know, ways that we are thinking about the work here, but also how this connects up with this project, which I see as a global decolonial initiative that you have got going in your context, that is so central to elevating, I think. I mean, it sounds like in indigenous ways of knowing, but I think the African and the Afro-descendant legacies that is everywhere, but maybe also silent in your respective context.
Okay, Professor, thank you. El profesor Sonn está bastante inquieto y le entusiasma muchísimo el conocer diferentes contribuciones, partiendo desde la diáspora africana. ¿Qué ha pasado con esa diáspora africana? ¿Cómo ha impactado nuestros pueblos latinoamericanos? ¿Qué tipo de contribuciones tenemos nosotros desde Latinoamérica, cómo se han llevado a cabo ciertos procesos con nuestros pueblos indígenas, también le llama mucho la atención y se entusiasma bastante de conocer ese tipo de proyectos que se han desarrollado en nuestros pueblos a lo largo de Latinoamérica.
Contribuciones en cuanto a qué, perdón, profesora Ivette.
Professor Sonn, the Professor Catherine says, asks that you said contribution of African, you mentioned African diaspora, you know, to Latin American territories and communities, right? So, but she wants to make, to be like clear about contributions in terms of what?
No, I'm thinking about the presence, the cultural presence, because I think so not contributions as in how have the African, whether it's expressed through music, whether it's through culture, whether it's through ways of being and identity and so forth. I see those all as contributions to knowledges. When I first went, my first time in one of the I think my first time in Venezuela, I think I learned about the presence in the landscape of African people, the bodies, but also the history. And often the history reflects the relationship to slavery and enslaved people and so forth. But then there's also a culture, history, memory. And so I'm interested in understanding how race works in Latin American context, yeah, how color works in Latin American context, and how, because I think my understanding, it's a limited understanding, is that race in the Latin American context is similar but also very different to Anglo spaces, or to Anglo-British British colonialisms, and so I'm interested in those sorts of articulations, but also just the ways of being, whether it's music, whether it's food, whether it's African memory, and how it is produced and reproduced and recovered, and how that shapes understandings of self, others, in the Latin American context. Because in those contexts, there's also race and racism, there's also racialization, and there's also particular forms of racialized violence that regulates African bodies, African presence. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Much sense. Thank you so much. Yes. Profesora Caterine, el profesor Sonn enfatiza en las contribuciones en términos de prácticas.
Okay.
Las prácticas indígenas. En su visita a Venezuela, algún momento, conoció de mucho tipo de prácticas y a través de las prácticas que han venido reconociendo con la diáspora africana, entonces conoce arte como basado en danza, de pronto en pintura, en escritura, ¿ok? Pero a través de nuestros territorios y nuestras comunidades latinoamericanas, quisiera conocer un poco más de esas prácticas que a lo mejor, y lo considera él, pueden diferir no mucho de las prácticas a las que él ha estado expuesto y las que él conoce.
Bueno, en América Latina y el Caribe, digamos, los pueblos indígenas, especialmente, tenido muchas contribuciones. De hecho, pues es una de nuestras raíces. Ubicaría como diversas contribuciones en el plano de la política, las formas de organización social y política que no son coyunturales, sino que vienen dentro de un devenir histórico, han generado cambios, transformaciones a nivel de la construcción de la Constitución. Se incorpora la Constitución visión indígena, más bien la episteme indígena, a la construcción de la Constitución, tanto que la tierra ya no es tratada como un objeto, sino como un sujeto. En ese sentido, las tierras tienen derechos, así como tiene la profesora Ivette. No sé si voy poco a poco o de una a todo, profesora Ivette.
Muy bien, continúa, profe.
Vale. A nivel de, por ejemplo, de esta parte de la política, yo rescataría la danza, pero la danza más allá del elemento estético, que me parece, la danza también, las artes fungen como una lucha desde la intrapolítica. Es decir, los pueblos indígenas de nuestras regiones, a partir de la danza, del arte, de estas prácticas que son ancestrales, que son cotidianas, ¿sí? Pueden resistir frente a un, digamos, a un proyecto neoliberal en expansión y globalizador. Es decir, a partir de ello recuperan sus identidades. También en el plano de la política hemos visto en el ejercicio de hacer también otra de, digamos, de ejercicios de poder. Por ejemplo, el mandar obedeciendo de digamos, de las comunidades zapatistas, el Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional aquí, en el caso mexicano, ¿no? En esto se ha dado, por decirlo, unas luchas autonómicas en donde ellos y ellas reivindican sus formas de organización social, políticas y comunitaria propias, así también como un derecho consuetudinario, es decir, un derecho que no emana de un derecho occidental, ¿no? Bastante basado en el iuspositivismo, sino un derecho a partir de sus prácticas culturales. En ese sentido, hay, digamos, una lucha constante por defender sus derechos, ¿no? Y eso yo creo que es una gran contribución para todos y para todas. ¿Sí? Ok.
Gracias, profesora Caterine. Entonces, Professor Sonn. The Professor Catherine says that in Mexico, for example, some of the contributions that she considers really important in the decolonization or decolonialism, you know, term, it's on the structure on politics with the incorporation of the land, which was added to the Constitution in Mexico as a key element of transformation of society, indigenous society and indigenous inclusion, okay? So, you know, and she highlighted the land is not treated as an object, but as a subject of rights.
Yes.
Right? And she also mentions dance beyond an aesthetic element. So in our Latin American indigenous communities, in the dance represents survival. That's it, because they were very brave and they resisted to the globalization and to the colonization and all these other terms. That's it.
Yes, that's amazing.
Ya. En el caso mexicano tenemos, pues, así como hay contribuciones, situaciones que son muy complejas. Por ejemplo, a nivel de América Latina y el Caribe, México es el último país que reconoce que sí tiene una tercera raíz como los pueblos afro. Es a partir del 2019, siglo XXI, en donde empieza a visibilizarse la población afro cuando ellos llegaron desde la época de la invasión española con toda esta diáspora. Entonces han sido muchos, pero muchos años de invisibilización. Ahora ellos están y ellas luchando por sus derechos, por ser reconocidos y rescate mexicano, encontramos que pues obviamente son un elemento gendarme, ¿no? En la parte de Costa Chica de Oaxaca, de Guerrero, en Veracruz, en los puertos, está en el arte.
Profesora
sí,
Caterine,
las diferentes artes.
no, yo no logro
¿Sí?
escucharte bien.
Ya. A ver, en
Profe
el
María
caso
del Pilar.
mexicano,
Profe, qué pena. Lo que pasa es que te empiezas y como que se te corta, entonces no queda uno como con la idea global. Pero lo que yo pues logré entenderle a la doctora Caterine es la lucha que tienen los pueblos africanos en México, que apenas son reconocidos desde el 2019. Entiendo que es por esa línea, Doc, pero si quiere sigue a ver si logramos, a ver.
han sido invisibilizados por muchos años y es el último país en América Latina donde reconoce que tiene una tercera raíz, lo cual implica, bueno, una deuda histórica del Estado mexicano con la población afro, la cual ha contribuido en las artes, ¿no? En el caso mexicano, pero también, digamos, dentro de sus usos, costumbres, atravesan la cotidianidad de las costas, por ejemplo, el caso mexicano, de los puertos, Costa Chica, etcétera, y bueno, hasta ahora ellos están bueno, lleva mucho tiempo en su lucha, pero hasta ahora es que logran ser reconocidos a nivel del Estado-Nación. Después, imagínate,
Okay.
después del proceso, imagínate cuándo fue el proceso de invasión española con la diáspora. Hasta 2019 se reconocen que existen afromexicanos, que es terrible.
Ok, gracias, profesora Catherine. Professor Sonn, the Professor Catherine just said, and she remarks the fact that only until 2019, Mexico as a nation, yes, and its government recognizes the Afro community as a third root.
Oh, in 2019?
Yes, 2019. Yes.
Wow.
And she wants to highlight the contribution of this Afro community coming from the African diaspora, you know, with their artistic work, not only dance, but also other ways to produce art.
Mm.
All right. And the visualization of Mexican indigenous, it's a struggle in Mexico all the time. Yeah.
Ahora, los movimientos indígenas, intelectuales en México han hecho bastantes cambios y contribuciones a nivel de la academia, eso sí.
Okay, and the indigenous communities have contributed too much to the academia.
Mm. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, John Gregory.
No, allí había un comentario que quería dejar la profe María del Pilar, que está en el chat, que ya es un comentario. Y creo que con esto ya podríamos ir cerrando la actividad. Agradecerle muchísimo al profesor Sonn y a todas y todos los que se han conectado, que nos han acompañado en esta doble jornada del día de hoy, que ha sido un día maravilloso de muchos aprendizajes.
Okay, Professor Sonn, John Gregory said that it has been a marvelous and incredible learning experience through the day. And then with your intervention, he really appreciates the time that you have been, you know, donated
Yes.
to this, Professor. Thank you very much. And we are very, very glad. And we have learned too much.
Oh no, I think I put a note in Spanish in the chat to everyone, but I'll also just say thank you very much for this opportunity. It's I think just in this last couple of minutes I've learned an amazing amount also. So I'm really really honored that Catherine and the organizing committee had invited me to be part of this conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Muchas gracias a todos, a todas.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, teacher.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, people.
Good night.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Ivette, te
Bye.
queremos agradecer. Gracias
Thank you,
por
Ivette.
ese apoyo
Por
que hiciste tan
supuesto,
maravilloso. De
Ivette,
verdad, estamos
gracias.
muy agradecidos, Ivette.
A ustedes, this was a great challenge to me too.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Ivette, you are amazing.
Thank you, Professor
Well
Sonn.
done. Thank you.
Thank
De
you.
verdad,
Bye.
no
Muchas
sabes
De
lo
verdad.
agradecido que estamos.
Cuenten con mi colaboración en futuros eventos. Ok,
Gracias.
cuenten con mi colaboración para todos. Un feliz resto de día.
Ok,
Gracias.
adiós.
Ok.
Adiós.
Bye.
Goodbye, Professor.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, people.
Goodbye, Professor Christopher.